All right, hello everyone. This is Andy. Today I'm filming a quick video demo on some basic tips for how to make a black and white collage. To start, before I began filming this video, I prepared the sheet of paper on which I'll be making my practice collage. And so rather than starting from a blank sheet of Bristol paper, I decided to give myself some interesting problems to work with and make it a bit more exciting to start from. So I toned my sheet of Bristol with some ink and laid down this really basic acrylic shape using gray acrylic paint that I mixed and dry brushing with this brush. And as for the rest of the materials, I have some pieces of scrap Bristol that I already painted some acrylic on, so from which we can make some shapes, cut them out and tear them. And I also have some ink still over there, glue, cutouts of materials I have around. This is the cardboard from a Kleenex box, but I also have a magazine cutout for hopefully some interesting pictures or patterns, and as well as these dried out newspaper sheets that we could possibly use for their text or other interesting visual patterns. And so the general idea is whenever you're making a collage, this is about an active process where you're always trying to plan out what your next step should be. Now, in terms of working from scrap materials, one of the first things I'm going to talk about is distinguishing different types of edges. And so edges are just when a piece of material meets another piece of material, or a zone of tone meets a different zone of tone as such. And so if you want and have scissors, the most basic type of edge you can do is just by cutting. And then that gives yourself a clean area to work with. So now I can consider laying down this sheet of paper on top, and I have this very visible straight edge in my collage now. But another type of edge you can do is also even more simpler, just by ripping. So this can sometimes give you a more interesting visual edge to work with. So rather than having just a straight clean break, we have now this interesting mark that comes from me tearing the paper, but also it brings out this new kind of negative shape, which is made from just the uneven layers of paper being exposed. All right, so now another element of edges that we can talk about is, while for this previous step, I was just thinking about the outside edge of form, we can also think about making edges on the inside of form. So I have this sheet of darker acrylic that, rather than just think about how I'm going to place it on the collage next, I'm going to cut out a basic hole on the inside by folding it in half. Once I have that started, I'm just going to rip it out. And so now we have an interesting shape that has an edge that could help us on the inside of this sheet of paper. And so this adds another interesting element which we have to plan for and think about how we're going to use. And so now if I look at this, if I look at what I have laid down so far, I just applied one sheet of Bristol. And so for the next, I might decide this could be interesting because after having cut out this inner shape and made this inner edge, we have this new kind of positive shape in there that's been formed by just layering on top this cutout sheet of Bristol. So next, we are going to talk about thinking about working through texture. And so for these previous steps, I've just only worked using Bristol paper with acrylic on top, and then messing around by drawing some marks. And so as a result, while I might have some interesting shapes and edges and forms on here, you can still tell that this is all pretty much the same kind of material. It's just been layered on in different ways. And so using the sheets of magazine cutouts, cardboard or newspaper that I mentioned before, you can now think about how we can incorporate different kinds of texture into our collage. And so one basic step I can do is simply just by taking some newspaper, ripping out a piece, crumpling it up a bit, and then now that I have this crumpled texture, figuring out, oh, do I want to, now place it on my collage in a way that will add some interesting contrast as a shape. But what we can also think about is layering materials and types on top of other types of materials. So as I put acrylic on top of Bristol, I can take this sheet of paper, for example, and think, well, I have ink right here. What if I dip this sheet of newspaper in ink, get it nice and wet, and now we have this really kind of messy but interesting material that we can add onto the collage. And because it's wet, I can actually more or less just stick it on without having to worry about the need to really glue. And as such, we have now a new edition of a visual type of material in our collage. Okay, so now that we spent some time cutting out materials and pasting them in our collage, or simply soaking and adding on top, we can also think about how we can use materials like acrylic paint or graphite, charcoal, etc. to draw over or paint over our collage in order to negate large areas and therefore give ourselves a more interesting surface to work with. And so what I mean by that is, even though I've spent some time making decisions as to where to put this and what to lay on top, I should never hesitate to also using, for example, this white acrylic paint, I should never hesitate to then simply go back and hide large areas and make it visually a little more interesting, because now it's less apparent that I've simply just glued objects on top, but that there's a process of layering happening. And so before, while we had an edge that was determined by this sheet of gray paper sitting on top of a light gray paper, we now have this more subtle edge that comes from just observing that there is a material sitting on top of this other material. But now, because of I'm applying such a liberal amount of really thick acrylic paint, there's this uniform texture that sits on top of both materials, and now gives me a kind of fresh new surface to work from. And so after thinking about types of edges and different textures, we can now combine these two together and to think overall about how you should always, once again, keep your eye on the large composition itself and figure out what your next step should be after observing and considering what else you might need to do to make your composition interesting and dynamic. So, for example, now that I've now that I've painted over this large space on top and have this kind of flat white surface, I might consider then going back with, say, this magazine cutout and thinking that I like this texture from this picture of snowy trees. I want to add that on top. And then using my acrylic brush, but also getting it messy with the remaining ink, I can then paint on top of this to seal it in and only show a little hidden sliver of that original photo. So now this brings me to my next point, which is, in doing so, it's now a little bit harder to tell in what order I actually put that piece of magazine cutout, because since I've hidden part of the bottom edge with this acrylic paint, it looks like it's just sitting there, but it's a little bit hard to tell, what is this sitting on top of? Is this, sitting on top of that magazine piece of paper, etc. And so this adds an element of quote unquote mystery into your collage, in that you're now more interested in this composition made up of different interesting materials, rather than being interested in, oh, I know the order in which the artist put these materials on top of this piece of paper, and I know what are the steps, I know all the steps of the process they used to make it. And so by working through different processes of layering, adding, and even subtracting, for example, maybe I don't really want all of this material over here, so I'm just going to go back and rip it off like so. But then, if I still like this shape that I have, why not just, perhaps dip it in some ink and then re-add it over here. Okay, so as you can see, I've just spent some time working on my collage. I've added on more elements, such as more Bristol paper, more of the magazine cutout, and I've also done a lot of work by hand, such as adding in some marks with my graphite crayon, painting with acrylic, dipping with ink, etc. And so at this stage of the process, I'm pretty happy with how things are going, but also now I'm trying to figure out what are the next steps that I can take because, again, making a collage is really about thinking about the larger process of making a composition. And so looking at this composition now, maybe I want to continue working on it upside down and thinking, okay, this is an interesting area that looks almost like a landscape or some kind of surface. And this is something that feels like it's more in the distance because it's a bit darker and it has this almost kind of mountainous shape to it. Or maybe I like the idea of working on it as a vertical portrait piece and thinking, do I like these vertical strips that are going up and down and how they contrast with what's happening horizontally, such as up here. But regardless, these things I'm thinking about as I'm trying to figure out what else needs to be added, how I can work with the shape, and do I even want to start thinking about cutting up the edges of this actual piece? So rather than this being just a perfect rectangle, do I want to tear off some edges or make this a more interesting shape itself? All these are different ways you can think about building your collage or working with the composition. But regardless, whatever you decide to do with your own process, the general sort of best practice is to really always take a step back, look at your entire surface or project, and always be thinking about what are the things I can do that help me get to a more interesting or exciting composition in the end, regardless what material that might take or whatever action you might need to do. Really, any of these materials can be subbed out for something else, or you can add in more materials than I'm using. But the general idea is to think about working with different textures, thinking about the edges they're using, the kinds of marks you'll make and add on, being confident enough to negate or cover up certain areas, and always thinking about the overall process and how to incorporate mystery or interesting elements into your composition that aren't just about layering up the same material, the same image, or creating the same pattern. So thank you for watching. I hope that this helps.